This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State agronomist Kraig Roozeboom and agricultural economics professor Beth Yeager kick off today's show as they explain research that looks into cover crops, double crop soybeans, and nitrogen in crop rotations to see how it impacts soil and profitability. After a little more from Kraig and Beth, Kansas Farm Service Agency's Allison Womack keeps the show rolling as she reminds listeners of deadlines and dairy margin coverage. The show concludes with K-State's Brad White and special guest Pedro Fontes discussing the effects of overconditioning bulls on fertility as part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show a little differently as we aren't starting with the Farm Service Agency. However, we will hear from them in our second segment. Instead, we start off our first segment of Agriculture Today talking about cover crops and double crop soybeans research with K-State Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom and agricultural economics professor at K-State Beth Yeager. Kraig, Beth, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Shelby.
Kraig, can you tell us a little bit about the research and the background of all this work that's been done?
Right. These are some results from a long-term study that we initiated back in 2007, looking at the effect of cover crops on our cropping system, on what at the time was a fairly typical cropping system where we have sorghum, followed by soybeans, followed by wheat, and then the cover crops would be planted after the wheat, and then we're cycling back to sorghum. So one of the main areas of emphasis was, okay, what's the impact of these cover crops on the sorghum crop? And initially we were looking at things like weed suppression, things like that. Included in that, we have, after every cover crop, we have multiple rates of nitrogen. So we have the ability to develop a nitrogen response curve for each crop. And it turns out that nitrogen management is a key component of managing your cover crops in the rotation. So we conducted that research over the years since 2007, and what we've recently done is put together a publication, soon to be published in Agronomy Journal, summarizing the yield and economics results from that study.
What were some of the responses you saw from the different variations?
Some of the main responses we had included a positive contribution of nitrogen if we had a legume cover crop planted after wheat ahead of the sorghum. We could get similar sorghum yields with 40 pounds less nitrogen if we had a summer legume cover crop. On the opposite side, if we had a non-legume cover crop like sorghum sedan and millet, I'm sure would have a similar response. Produces lots of biomass. We like it because it's good for soil carbon building, things like that. But it took us 40 pounds more nitrogen to get similar sorghum yields after that, because it would basically tie up nitrogen in all of that residue.
What were you really hoping to find then for farmers when you did all this work for multiple years?
Yeah, the idea was, okay, cover crops, and again, this is back in 2007, cover crops were just ramping up. They've been around, but they've gained a lot of traction since then. And as I said, weed suppression is one area of interest, but nitrogen fixation is an area of interest. Can we reduce our N rates? Nitrogen is an expensive input. Herbicides are an expensive input, and so can we have positive yield and economic outcomes for cropping systems and at the same time get all these environmental benefits that the cover crops bring? We didn't necessarily measure them in this study, but we do know they reduce soil erosion, help build soil carbon. Actually, we have measured some of those responses now as well. And so the idea was, okay, this is a management technique that's becoming more commonplace. what are the effects on our cropping systems? How can we best manage it to work out to have positive both biological, cropping system yield, and economic responses?
Beth, looking at the economic perspective, what are some things you saw from this research?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the cover crop treatments, or when we really were thinking about cover crops, it was an alternative to chemical fallow. And so one of the treatments that we looked at was double crop soybeans. And so that was by far the most profitable treatment that we examined or that we added to the rotation. And that was largely because that allowed for, in all years except for one, it allowed for the harvest of an additional crop. And so there was additional income coming in with that treatment response. Our other cover crop treatments that we looked at, while they did have a lot of positive environmental benefits, we weren't observing those benefits from the economic side. There's some cases where we were able to lower our herbicide use in those cover crop treatments. And so because of the less herbicides being applied, less treatments going across the field, we were able to reduce some costs there. However, just the cost of the seed, the planting, in some cases termination of those cover crops certainly increased cost. And so by and large, economically speaking, it was more costly to incorporate these cover crop treatments, again, with the exception of the double crop soybeans. What we didn't examine and is likely important for a lot of our producers is the ability to use cover crops for forage or grazing. That's something we weren't able to measure in this study, as well as that weed suppression. So like I noted, we did have fewer chemical treatments in terms of herbicides on most of our cover crops. And that's a way to reduce costs. There's some other environmental benefits in some cases. There's some cost share programs that help to cover the cost of cover crops that can be beneficial to producers as well to consider. But overarching, by far, double crop soybeans was the most profitable treatment.
So just doing the rotation and doing it doesn't mean you're going to get a profit.
Exactly. Yes. Yep. So the double crop soybeans are the soybeans planted after wheat when typically we would have had fallow. And so that did, like I said, in all but 1 year, we were able to harvest that soybean crop. And so that did increase returns. And typically the following sorghum yield was not negatively impacted by the double crop soybeans as well.
I'll just add about the double crop soybeans. Right, it's not technically a cover crop. And so in some ways, we often thought about it as a secondary check. Dr. Yeager mentioned the check was chemical fallow. Okay, we harvest the wheat, apply herbicides to keep the weeds and volunteer wheat down until sorghum planting the following spring. And so in many ways, this coincides. Over the years now, we've had more and more discussion of intensifying our cropping systems, diversifying our cropping systems. So this all fits with those ideas, right? And so double crop soybeans are, as I said, kind of that secondary check. They're not a cover crop. We're harvesting the grain. But what we found, yes, better income. We got bushels to sell it, and the yields were not great. 1 year it was a crop, it was a failure. But 1 year out of 9 harvests, we didn't have soybeans to harvest. But that's a fairly low failure rate. Yields ranged anywhere from 10 to 12 bushels per acre, not great, but in 1 year we had nearly 60 bushels per acre. So it really depends on the year, but at least you have the potential for that income. So in addition to the economic benefits of the double crop soybeans, in subsequent work we've done soil sampling looking at the impacts on soil. It did not have a negative impact on sorghum yield like some of the other high biomass, high CDN cover crops, and sometimes even contributed a little nitrogen, kind of like the summer legume cover crop. But it also helped build carbon over time, the double crop soybeans. We measured several chemical characteristics of the plots where these treatments were imposed, as well as biological activity. And even though the double crop soybeans didn't get us as much of a response as the cover crops, it got us, like I would say, halfway there, and we're still getting the additional economic return. And so Obviously, it just reinforces the fact that anytime you can intensify, diversify the system, even if you're harvesting that crop, there's the potential to gain environmental benefits.
What are the key points you really like farmers to take from this work you guys have done?
Absolutely. So I think for me, the biggest key takeaway is for farmers really to be aware of their own input cost. One thing that, as I mentioned before, rarely did we see the cover crops increase net returns compared to chemical fallow. However, keeping in mind what environmental benefits may be there and the environmental impacts, if there are any cost share programs or opportunities to look at, opportunities for grazing, thinking about those benefits in terms of the reduced runoff, the ability to really better manage or use weed suppression without having to rely on so many herbicide treatments is critical, but to really keep in mind their own cost as well as how they're marketing their crops and the prices that they're receiving for crops, because that's one thing that we did keep constant in this study were the costs and the prices. And so our variability in net returns were really driven by annual yield variability. And so the importance just for farmers to do their annual budgets and to really keep those numbers in mind to see how it may impact them.
That was agricultural economics professor at Kansas State University, Beth Yeager, and she was joined by K-State cropping systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom as they talked about cover crops and double crop soybeans and crop rotations and how it impacted profitability. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but once we come back, we'll once again be joined by Kraig and Beth as we finish up our conversation. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and as we continue our show, we also continue our conversation with K-State Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom and agricultural economics professor at K-State, Beth Yeager. Kraig, as we continue talking about this research when it comes to cover crops, double crop soybeans, nitrogen, all in this crop rotation, are there any other thoughts you'd like to share with listeners?
We mentioned the impact on sorghum yield. Sorghum's the crop that immediately followed the cover crop, double crop treatments. But we picked up responses in the other crops as well. So after sorghum, the next sorghum's harvested in the fall, next spring we'd plant soybeans. Not often a big response to whatever happened ahead of the sorghum, but something that was fairly consistent was that the soybeans after the sorghum, which was planted after the cover crop treatments, tended to do a little bit better after or in the plots that had this high biomass sorghum sudan. Now, that was the most negative in terms of sorghum yield, but it helped out the soybeans. And my theory, I don't know if we have good data to back this up, but that was the highest residue. Those plots had the most amount of residue, conserved the most moisture, I think. And especially late in the seasons when soybeans tend to need more water than some of our other crops, it worked out to be not a huge benefit, but we picked up a little yield bump in many years and averaged over all the years. We picked up a yield bump there. After that and after even the winter non-legume, which in this case we haven't talked about it, but it was some kind of a brassica, rapeseed, canola, those kinds of things. And so not fixing any nitrogen, but cycling it through. And see, that one doesn't leave a lot of residue. So something else is going on there. So that was interesting. The other thing that was interesting was the wheat. And before I go on to that, I'll back up to the soybeans. In particular, what makes me think the moisture conservation was an aspect of the yield bump in the soybeans following or in the plots that had the high biomass sorghum sudan cover crop, is that in 2012, if you think back to 2012, very dry year. And a lot of our crops took a big yield hit in the study and, across the region. Those plots, soybeans in those plots, that's one of the years we really saw a big bump in soybean yields if they were in those high residue plots. So there were effects beyond just that immediate sorghum crop. Even in the wheat. Obviously, the wheat's planted in the fall immediately after soybean harvest. And in that situation, we picked up in plots that had the winter legume. Now, that was the one that was the most beneficial to the sorghum, right? We could get similar yields with less nitrogen. And it tended to have some of the better wheat yields 2 years after those cover crops had been in place. And so there are some legacy effects throughout that entire rotation. And again, we did multiple cycles. We're summarizing 3 cycles of the rotation here in these plots and in this paper that we're talking about. So it's not just that immediate crop that is affected by the cover crops as they're put into the rotation.
If people are wanting to read some on this study, how can they do that?
Well, if you get into the scientific literature, we've got a publication coming out in Agronomy Journal within the next few weeks. And the name of that is Cover Crops, Double Crop Soybean and Nitrogen Rates Affect Productivity and Profitability of a No-Till Rotation.
They can also reach out to the Agricultural Economics Department or the Agronomy Department at K-State.
Beth, Kraig, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom and agricultural economics professor at Kansas State University, Beth Yeager, discussing their research publication, Cover Crops, Double Crop Soybeans, and Nitrogen Rates Affect Productivity and Profitability of a No-Till Rotation. If you would like to read more on this publication, they recommend that you reach out to K-State's Agricultural Economics Department or Agronomy Department and ask for more information. I will link those email addresses in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by Kansas Farm Service Agency's Agricultural Program Specialist, Allison Womack. Allison, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Allison, reminding producers and listeners of some farm program deadlines that are coming up.
That's correct. So first we have on March 15th, the Non-Insured Disaster Assistance Program, better known as NAP, coverage for non-insurable spring planted crops. That deadline is March 15th. So reach out to your county office if you have any eligible crops for that. April 15th is the deadline for the ARC PLC program. So make sure you're getting all your signatures in for that.
For ARC and PLC, preferring that producers go ahead and get in the office and start at least getting things rolling?
Yes, it's best to get into the office. Let's say you're on a new farm that you weren't on last year, or you're changing your shares, something like that. It's best to be in person so you can get all that worked out, face to face. It helps. It's not necessary, but it really does help.
Also wanting to note that this year's deadline is different from what it usually has been in past years.
Correct. In the past, it's been March 15th. I think we got a little bit later of a start this year, so they've extended it to that April 15th deadline. And speaking on farm records, as we approach that time of year where you're locking in all that stuff, it's also important to go to your county office to ensure you're updating all your farm records, not just for our PLC purposes, but, CRP, any other programs that we have. If you've sold some land, purchased some land, you've changed your interest from an individual to a trust or an LLC. Maybe if you have one of those entities, you've, rearranged your structures, shares, that we need to know. Let's say you've gone from cash rent to shares or vice versa. That's, right now is a great time to let us know all those changes.
And at the Farm Service Agency, a lot of times CRP comes right along with it. And what are some reminders when it comes to the CRP?
Right. So we are approaching the primary nesting season. So for those of you that had mid-contract management practices that you're trying to complete, make sure you're reaching out to your local county office. We did have a recent release of the federal biological opinion on the lesser prairie chicken. So the western side of the state is probably more so affected with this, but your primary nesting season dates have changed if you're in that affected area. So make sure you're reaching out to your county office, ensuring that you have the right practice, the applicable dates that you need to complete it by, and all the paperwork that you're going to need to get that done.
Allison, while we're also talking about things with the Farm Service Agency, wanting to mention one of your programs, Dairy Margin Coverage.
That's right. DMC deadline for sign up is going to be at the end of this month, March 31st. The Dairy Margin Coverage Program is a program designed to assist dairy operations when the milk prices go down and feed prices go up. Payments are triggered when the difference between the national all-market price and national average feed costs, aka the margin, falls below the margin level. That's been selected by the dairy producer. So it's going to have a $100 admin fee. By paying that admin fee, you're automatically going to lock into catastrophic coverage, but you do have the option to buy up coverage, and those premiums are going to be due in September of the coverage year. This program is a calendar year program. It's not like most of our others that are, crop year, fiscal year related. So deadline for that, March 31st. Reach out to your county office to get signed up for that.
Does it matter what size of dairy operation it is if they can use dairy margin coverage?
No, size does not matter.
What about for marketing assistance loans?
Right, so we're approaching one of our first final availability dates. That's going to be March 31st. So the most common crops for that date, March 31st, is going to be wheat, barley, oats, honey, and seed cotton. So you have until March 31st of this year to request a marketing assistant loan. Again, marketing assistance loans are short-term loans designed to be, quick in nature, low interest rates, as opposed to your local bank. They're 9 months, so reach out to your county office on those.
Allison, as always, when people from the Farm Service Agency come in, we want to mention where they can find out some more information.
Right. So Farmers.gov is a one-stop resource for producers to learn about USDA programs on an agency-wide basis. So it's going to encompass farm loan programs, farm programs, conservation programs. The site provides deadline reminders for various program signups. I believe you can sign up for email reminders there. Producers can access their individual farm records, and they have the ability to e-sign some program documents. The site can also link you up to the Farm Loan Assistance Tool, an online portal to apply for a farm loan. At that site, interested individuals can learn which farm loan may be right for them and learn more about general eligibility and view instructions on how to help them with the forms that they're needed to apply for a loan.
But also mentioning that face-to-face interaction is still available at service centers around the state.
Right. We have some great staff across the state, so they'd love to come in and see you.
Allison, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, guys.
That was Agricultural Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Allison Womack. As always, if you want to find out more information about the programs she mentioned in today's show or other programs from the Farm Service Agency, you can do that by going online to Farmers.gov or by going into your local service center. I will link more information about both of those in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we wrap up our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with K-State's Brad White and special guest Pedro Fontes.
The next topic I'd like to hit on is sire diet and fertility. And Pedro, this is an area that you've done some research on over-conditioning bulls and what's the impact of fertility. Maybe tell us a little bit about your work.
When I started here in Georgia, within our extension program, we get to work firsthand developing bulls here in our program, and we get a lot of questions from commercial producers. And one of the main concerns that I heard as soon as I started my position was bulls getting over-conditioned. I think we're fortunate to have a good nutritionist here taking care of our bulls, and our bulls are pretty fit when they go out there to breed cows, the bulls that come out of our program. But we know that some situations, bulls out there in the industry, they can get a little bit over-conditioned. So the first study that we've done was basically more of an observational study where we look BSC records from different veterinary practices, and we trace back bulls based on their we evaluated the ability of those bulls to pass a BSC based on their subcutaneous back fat thickness measurements on their carcass ultrasound. So basically what we were able to see or show in that study is as subcutaneous back fat thickness increased, in those young yearling beef bulls, the probability of those bulls to fail the breeding soundness exam increased, right? So if you look at natural variation in our young virgin bull population and the amount of adipose tissue that those bulls are depositing, the ones that are excessively fat, they have a greater probability of failing the BSCs, and most of the failures were associated with morphology defects. So, in other words, we saw an increase in sperm morphology defects. And that's interesting because when you go in the literature and you start looking at studies where folks experimentally fed bulls to get bulls over condition, they see the exact same thing. Right. So if you go there and purposely feed bulls in a way that you're going to get those bulls extremely over-conditioned, you start seeing those detrimental effects on semen morphology. More recently, we've been working with the University of Florida in a collaboration, and we've been actually taking that research a step further. So we're not only looking at semen quality, but we're actually looking at the ability of those sperm cells to successfully develop a pregnancy. Right, and trying to relate back to the diet of the bull. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is that whenever we experimentally feed bulls to get over condition, and when we collect those bulls and we use that semen in an IVF setting, so in vitro fertilization, what we notice is that we negatively impacted the ability of those embryos to develop all the way to the blastocyst stage, which is something that most of us usually don't think about, right? When you're thinking about male fertility, you're thinking about those sperm cells and their ability to, swim through the reproductive tract of the female and hopefully fertilize the egg. And we usually associate male fertility with the ability of that semen to elicit fertilization. But what we're learning over the last 5 to 10 years is that the bull plays an important role in early embryonic development. Okay, so the male plays a role in early embryonic development, which happens after fertilization occurs. So the sperm cell is not only in charge of, it's not only a DNA bullet as we traditionally thought of. It actually has some other key molecular features that are playing a role in the ability of those embryos to develop. And what we're seeing is that those bulls that are over-conditioned, they negatively impact that process of embryonic development after fertilization. And one cool fact about that is that that happens in humans as well. So when you look at human epidemiological data in human fertility clinics, when those couples are struggling to become pregnant and they might undergo a process of in vitro fertilization, what we see in humans as well is that if the male is obese, and they usually use a body mass index metric, so if the male is obese or overweight, the likelihood of that couple to successfully become pregnant after IVF is also decreased as well. So it's quite interesting to think about, what we're feeding bulls is actually influencing the ability of it's not only influencing the semen quality, but also influencing the ability of embryos to develop within the reproductive tract of the cow.
That's all we have for now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.